Without knowing it, you have a little flash that's come up from that dimension. And then the next moment, it may come up a few days later again when you look into the eyes of a baby, 1 year old. Maybe just in the street or in a cafe. And the baby looks at you, and the baby is 1 year old, and the eyes are like the baby's. And you know instinctively that the baby is not thinking about you, because thinking hasn't started yet. The words have not accumulated yet, the thoughts haven't started yet, and yet there's a consciousness there, and you can see very clearly there's an intense consciousness that's looking through those eyes at you without judging you in any way. And in that moment, for just a few seconds, you feel so good. And you say, oh. Why do you feel so good? Because at that moment, the baby liberated you from your stream of thinking, and again, a little bit of spaciousness opened up inside you. For those few seconds when you looked into the eyes of the baby, you were not thinking, and the baby wasn't thinking. So through the baby, you were able to be in that dimension, and it felt so good. Spontaneously, they can arise. They're not recognized by people as ultimately spiritual, but they are. And so many people, there are millions of people who experience those things briefly, but that's enough to give you a sense still of life is worth living. And then there are others who are so burdened by their minds, they cannot even communicate with a baby. They cannot even perceive the beauty of nature anymore because their mind is so noisy that they never total veil. So they don't look at the baby like, They look at the baby, oh, that's a nice baby. They don't really see the baby. Immediately it's labeled. Dogs do the same thing. They can free you from your mind briefly. Whether it's your dog or somebody else's dog, you're walking in the street, somebody's coming with a dog. For a moment you look at this dog and into the eyes of the dog and you go, oh. 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. The dog is not thinking about you, but you looked into the eyes of the dog and you sensed something there. And what was that? You say it's a dog. Well, you sensed something there that you connected with. And what was that you sensed that you connected with? Your mind says, oh, that's a nice dog, but that's rubbish. You sensed something there. What you sensed was the consciousness of the dog. Because the dog also is an expression of consciousness, a manifestation of consciousness, just as you are. But the dog does not live on the level of consciousness of thinking. The dog's consciousness is below thinking. And so the dog is not burdened by thinking. The dog is not burdened by a self-image created by the mind. The dog has no problem with his or her personal history, nor has the dog a problem with self-esteem. The dog doesn't have a problem with body image. None of that. The dog has no opinion about itself. It is. The dog just is. Because the dog lives below thought. The consciousness of the dog is below conceptual thinking. It doesn't have the egoic identity. Although in some dogs you can see the beginnings of an ego identity because they've lived with human egos for so long. And some dogs are actually neurotic because after 5 years of living with a highly neurotic person, they have succumbed. But many dogs are surprisingly sane considering who they live with. And you would say, how can this dog still be so happy living with this miserable person? So you look into the eyes of a dog and for 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, you'd connect with the consciousness of the dog. And that ultimately, first of all, that frees you, without you knowing it, frees you for this moment from the stream of thinking, Because the dog, you can sense the dog isn't thinking, the dog has no opinion about you. You may have heard the prayer, please God, make me into the person my dog thinks I am. But of course that's not true, because the dog doesn't think what or who you are. So it doesn't have an opinion, it can sense, yes. So an animal, by connecting with an animal, it can free you for a moment from the noise of your mind, and something opens up in you that is the emptiness. The term emptiness in Buddhism, my term is spaciousness. Something opens up that is a moment of no thought, but no loss of consciousness. Normally no thought is associated with loss of consciousness. You stop thinking because you're going to sleep. Or you stop thinking because thoughtless is a negative term in conventional usage. When you say thoughtless is a negative term, and I know what they mean, but when we use the term thoughtless here, it's a positive term. Thoughtless awareness. Awareness is to be able to be free of thought. When these moments happen in you, you relate to something happens, for a moment it frees you from thinking. And, well, sex can do it too. Well, I don't know if you experience if you go to the expo here, probably not. But it frees you for a moment, it can free you from thinking. It doesn't last that long, I suppose. And so it's just, And then, interesting, you have probably either experienced it or seen it in movies. They make love, and it's so wonderful love, and then they separate, and then they make a cup of coffee, and immediately they start fighting again. Because immediately the mind starts up again, the egoic mind. Crazy. So what you love in the dog is ultimately not the fur. It's lovely to touch, certainly, to hold a dog. It's beautiful, lovely to touch. But what you really love in the dog is the consciousness of the dog. And when you love the consciousness of the dog, there is a recognition of oneness, because there's only one universal consciousness. This is not a scientifically verifiable statement, but I don't care. There's only one universal consciousness that emanates from the source of all life. The source is a bit like the sun. And from the source of all life, which does not exist in space or time, it's in the transcendent dimension, from the source emanates, like from the sun, the light emanates continuously. From the source of all life, what emanates is consciousness, the light of consciousness. And then consciousness manifests in different vibrational frequencies in our so-called universe. It manifests as physical forms. In the case of humans, consciousness can manifest as a physical form. It can manifest as thought. Consciousness can manifest as pure consciousness, in the same way that water can manifest as solid ice. You can hit somebody over the head with water. It is very painful when it's ice, and then it becomes fluid, but it's still water. And then it becomes vaporous mist, and you can't even see it anymore, but it's still water. In the same way, consciousness manifests in different vibrational frequencies, or this I'm talking about on the level of humans as the physical body, the mind, and what most humans don't know yet, consciousness itself, which is the spaciousness, this so-called, the Buddhist, emptiness. So for a moment, certain situations can free you from the incessant stream of thinking, but it's not enough. It's not enough. You can't just wait for occasional, once a week, 3-second, 10-second encounters with a dog. And if you're familiar with your dog, that you live with every day, then it could be less likely to happen because you become too familiar with the dog. And so you relate to the dog only through thinking, and you start talking to the dog all the time. Don't do that. Go here. What are you doing there? You're not supposed to do that. So, a dimension of consciousness can occasionally emerge spontaneously. Once you know that this is possible, those moments when it does happen, like when you're out in nature, or if you're surfing, we are near the ocean here, there may be some of you who go surfing, and that can be a beautiful thing, because you might realize when you are surfing, if you're good at it, you're not thinking while you're riding a wave. You can't be thinking about tomorrow's dinner, or yesterday's breakfast, or your life problems, your problematic identity. No, then you'll fall off there. Of course, if you are good at it, you have to be absolutely present. And you feel so alive during those moments because it frees you from the personality. The activity frees you from the person. Briefly. Well, yeah. The activity frees you from the person. And so you get extremely attached to that kind of activity that requires your complete presence. Requires your complete presence. Which means, while you are engaged in that activity, you are not thinking. You are just present. And so you experience it as extremely joyful and life-enhancing, and you feel in some way, you feel not only more alive, you feel you're more fully yourself, although you don't remember yourself. And that's why you feel more fully yourself. That's a strange paradox. You feel your beingness more than before. But your beingness, your presence, is not your history. That has been removed temporarily when you're engaged, when you're climbing a rock wall, and you have to be absolutely present with every moment, and otherwise you'll fall off. Then it frees you from thinking completely. It clears your mind. Any dangerous activity does that if you survive. There was a man, a famous actor, who got thrown off his horse and then became completely paralyzed. I think he's dead, passed away. He played Superman, which is a strange paradox. But so he got thrown off the horse and broke his back. And he said later, at some point, that while he was riding this horse, he was starting to think, and so he lost presence, and in that moment he fell. Let's hope that while he was disabled during those years, that he was able, I don't know if he was, that he was able to go more deeply within and discover that which lies beyond the person and the personality. But interesting that he said, in that moment he got lost in thought, and then he fell. The horse stumbled, and he got thrown off. These things can be very pleasant, lovely to do, because they free you temporarily, but even that is not enough, and it could be too risky to continuously engage in high-risk activities. So, but these are glimpses. These can give people glimpses of what it means to experience the cessation of thinking. The cessation of thinking without loss of consciousness. In fact, an intensification of consciousness. And that is Zen. Zen is that state of consciousness, of intense presence, where thinking can happen, but you're not in the grip of thinking. You're aware, you're one with that inner spaciousness. You're experiencing cessation of the stream of thinking, and yet you're completely conscious. Conscious even of yourself, but not of yourself as the history self, the historical self, not that self, not the personal self, the transcendent self, which the Buddhists call the no-self, or which in Hinduism is called the great self, or the Atman. They're just words, of course. So the important thing to realize is, as you rise above thinking, there's presence, you're present. And then you may fall back into thinking. And then you come out of thinking again. And that is a state of heightened alertness without tension, relaxed alertness. And you can then sense what is below thinking is also in a state of connectedness that you are in when you rise above thinking. And so you connect more deeply with the world of nature, with the animals and the plants, because they exist below thinking. And you can rise above thinking. And sometimes all those beings that exist below thought can help you, strangely, can help you rise above thought. Because it is the human destiny to rise above thought. It is not our destiny to fall back below thought, enticing as it may be for some people who are so burdened by their minds that they say just anything, I can't live with myself any longer. If I have to be a cow, I'll rather be a cow than a human because I won't be so unhappy anymore. But please just let me be a cow either in Switzerland or India, not other places. I would want to be a cow either in the alpine pastures of Switzerland or in India where they respect you. But still, even there, I would not choose for my next lifetime to return as a cow, and probably you wouldn't. Or even at this moment, I say, if you could just push a button, if you were completely unhappy, push a button, say, you can be completely free of unhappiness, but you have to become a dog, you have to become a cow, you have to become a tree. Are you going to do it? Of course, it means you're losing consciousness in some way because you are on the level of thought. You would have to fall below thought. So if you're totally unhappy, you say, I'll do it, I can't stand it anymore. Of course, an alternative to that imaginary situation is to have a few drinks, because they also take you below thought. Free you briefly from the burden of the personality, so you feel more alive and you laugh more and you sing, and it's so wonderful until you completely become really unconscious. It was so good. I can't remember my problems anymore at all. I don't even remember who I am. This is so good. You're falling below thinking. Feels good for a while, and then you move to complete unconsciousness. That's not the way to go. But I can see why it has an attraction for many people who are on a daily basis burdened by their minds. 24 hours a day almost, except in dreamless sleep. So, falling below thinking, you experience it naturally as you go from wakefulness to sleep in the intervening period, just as you begin to move towards sleep at night in your bed. You experience a very pleasant moments there when you don't remember your problems anymore. So good. And sleep says, come this way, come. And you go there, and then you're gone. Most humans are trapped, evolutionary terms, in thought. Thought is a wonderful thing to have evolved in human beings, but it had a huge downside. It doesn't mean we have to give up thinking. What we give up or what we transcend is being trapped in thinking, being identified with thinking. And then, when we can free ourselves from thinking and realize that thinking, the thoughts, are not who we are, then thinking can be a wonderful tool for creating and manifesting. It is then used in the service of the deeper or higher consciousness through you, and then it's wonderful. But when thinking has taken up your entire sense of identity, when you derive your entire sense of self from thinking, that is a terrible fate. But that is where we are at the moment in evolutionary terms, because we are reaching the end of this period of egoic thinking, of being trapped in thinking. Thinking has created great things, enormous achievements, but, as I said, a huge downside, massive downside of such seriousness that it could even lead to the destruction of the species. That's the downside of thinking. If thinking becomes more and more differentiated and developed, for example, science is a differentiated form of specialized form of thinking, and that has grown and enormous achievements, and yet thinking itself has not been transcended. So the egoic nature of thinking has become intensified too. So where we are at now is we reach this stage where we have to jump to the next level of human evolution. If we remain trapped in thinking, that will be extremely destructive, because what thinking can create will become so destructive, it will show more and more the destructive side rather than the potentially helpful side. And this is why what is happening here is so vitally important, not just for you as a person, but for humanity as a whole. We have to transcend this being trapped in thought. And so the incredible possibility arises for humans to, and this is the awakening, the incredible possibility arises for you to experience in your daily life increasingly states of consciousness, or a state of consciousness, when you're not thinking, but you're completely there. And this enormous power suddenly comes through you, power that before was always trapped in thinking. Another way of putting it, the light of consciousness was always heavily obscured by thinking. Thinking is the form consciousness takes. It takes forms, but the forms, it gets trapped in the forms. So the unawakened state is complete identification of consciousness with the form consciousness takes, and that manifests in the simplest situations. When you go into a situation, I often give the examples because it's one of the simplest situations. When thinking starts, you get up in the morning, you open the curtains, and you look out, and if the weather is not good, which is less likely to happen here than in London or Vancouver, when the weather is not good, you look out and immediately say, oh, it's another dreadful day. Another dreadful day, look at that. And you don't realize that it's not a dreadful day, it's just what is dreadful is the thought. The day is as it is. There's water coming from the sky. There are clouds, and sunlight is filtering through the clouds. That's what is. It's not a dreadful day, but you mistake your interpretation with reality. So you can't separate the two. And you go into every situation and you confuse your judgments with the reality of the situation. And that begins to change when you become aware of your own thinking. And then you no longer need to do that. And then you can be in the same situation that before was perceived. You told yourself it was terrible, having to stand there and wait at the airline counter, and there's the most inefficient and stupid people. How do they get their jobs? Can't they train these people? And you don't experience it like that anymore. You experience the separation, and then you experience 90% of your unhappiness falling away. 90%, and realizing that 90% of unhappiness in whatever form, upset, irritation, anger, resentment, anxiety, etc., they're all forms of what the Buddha called dukkha, suffering, misery, unhappiness. 90% of that falls away because you realize that every situation is as it is. And you no longer impose judgments on it, and because the judgments you impose on what is make you unhappy. The unhappiness doesn't come because you have to wait there in line for so long and the flight is cancelled and you get very irritated and very unhappy. It comes from what your mind is telling you about the situation. And when you let go of what your mind is telling you, you suddenly see, here it is. And you look around. You see, you're standing there. People, lights, you're breathing. That's what is. People running around or not running around. And all kinds of movement. That's this moment without an interpretation. There's no suffering in it, no irritation, no unhappiness. And so you have separated what the mind imposed on the situation and the situation itself, and you realize the situation is neutral. It has an isness to it, which is just easy. It is. The rest, the suffering came over what your mind had to say about the situation. And that's an incredible realization that 90% of your suffering, to use the term suffering, unhappiness, upset, etc., comes from unconscious thinking and confusing what is with what your mind is saying about what is. When you can be with what is and no longer impose unnecessary baggage, commentary on what is, life is enormously freed suddenly, your life. And a huge chunk of egoic identity has broken off. And you go around in a sense of ease and lightness, always aligning yourself with the isness of this moment, which, by the way, is the only one there ever is. People don't seem to know that. It's a secret. Don't tell anybody. There's only this moment. People don't know that. But I know. There's only this moment. And so you become aligned with the isness of this moment without imposing automatic, unconscious, conditioned commentaries on it. And somehow always seeking a sense of self in it, feeling diminished by one situation, or wanting to hang on and complaining if it leaves you, or anticipating thoughts that something might change, could change, and then you think about that and you can't enjoy the moment because you're worried about the next moment. Worried means thinking. Useless thinking is worry. So you're worried about the next moment, which prevents you from enjoying this moment. So you're thinking about the next moment, which never comes. You're thinking about something that cannot possibly ever come. That must be crazy. And the underlying assumption is that the next moment is definitely more important than this one, because something big is going to happen there, not here. Something big is going to happen there. I don't know if it's good or bad yet, but it's something big. If the mind focuses on good, it's called hope. I hope for my life to really improve at some point. It's going to be good. But the content, that has a downside. That thought has a downside. And the downside is it might get worse. And that's fear. Oh my God, what's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to me? I don't know what's going to. I have to think more about this. There must be a solution to it. There must be a solution to the dilemma of my existence. Perhaps a psychiatrist has the answer. Or you can go to a clairvoyant and says, what's going to happen to me? You're going to be fine. Oh, thank you. And then you're going to die. What? I didn't know that. It's not supposed to happen. Thought. So to develop the ability to experience things and people and situations and places without imposing too much thought on it. And then life becomes much more enjoyable suddenly. And people, you can even enjoy people. Now, as you probably know, one of the most challenging things in your life is other people. Because they're so difficult. People are so challenging. And for many people, one of their greatest sources of suffering or unhappiness, strangely enough, is other people. Sometimes, of course, it might be a situation, but it's usually every situation is associated with certain people. But of course, another source of unhappiness, of course, could be your physical body, which might become ill. That's a different matter. But yes, people are difficult. It's not surprising that Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, said, hell is other people. That's the ego talking, of course. Life could be so much nicer with all these dreadful people around. And of course, these are judgments. These are judgments of the mind. And the moment you encounter another human being, the moment you meet another human being, if you are trapped in the conditioned mind, you will very quickly have things to say about him or her. And the moment you have thought arising, you're imposing judgment, you can't really experience that human being anymore. And so that happens all the time when people meet others. But what would it be if I could meet another human being and just look into his or her eyes without making it too obvious? Even in ordinary situations, you go to a restaurant, you go to a shop, you buy something, you pay for it. There's a brief interaction with the person you give the money to. Are you able to just look at this person for a few seconds while the transaction happens and be free of thinking? There's suddenly a connection. There's no need to make it obvious. You don't go like... And you don't have to tell them, I'm connecting with you on a spiritual level. Because they'll go, what? But it's a beautiful thing to be able to be spacious with another human being. It's easier with a dog, obviously, because the dog does not have the screen of mind that obscures that sense of presence or beingness in the dog, the consciousness of the dog. Humans usually have this screen of mental stuff, so it's not as easy to relate deeply. You have to penetrate the level of mind, which sometimes is not all that pleasant either. It's like can be very difficult conditioning of this personality. Some personalities are very difficult or might be aggressive or whatever. But it's looking at another human being and just like this, no thought. And it's always pleasant. It's a pleasant, suddenly you sense a connection and it's pleasant. But don't try that too soon. Start with a tree. Because there's nothing in the way with a tree, there's no mind. The tree is an expression of consciousness, but the tree is very still. It's even stiller than the dog. The tree is just, it might have been there for 100 years, 200 years, 300 years. Some trees have been there for 1,000 years. And so you can look at a tree, and by looking means, when you look at something, you give it your attention, then there's a tree. And you give it your complete attention. Just look at the totality of it, and then occasionally you look at little details. Just be with it and the totality of the tree, without needing to impose any thought on it. You don't need to call it anything. You don't need to know the name in order to experience the tree. You don't need to know the name of the tree. Fine, there's nothing wrong with knowing the name of the tree. But the name of the tree can, if you're too attached to the name of the tree, can prevent you from experiencing the tree. And that is a very common thing, how the moment you name something, you think that's it. And then you don't realize that there is a depth to that which the name obscures. The spiritual teacher Krishnamurti said to somebody, the moment you teach a child the name of the bird, he or she will never see that bird again. Slight exaggeration, of course he'll see that bird again, but what he means is the child will lose the deeper connectedness with the bird because the mental label will be in the way, and the child will mistake the mental label for it.